This is the 5th video of my story of my father, Mack Nations and Richard Hickok, footprints found inside in cold blood. I'm going to pick up where the 4th video left off, and I had ended that talking about a quote from page 131 of In Cold Blood. It says, "When Perry said, 'There must be something wrong with us,' Hickok responded, 'Deal me out, baby. I'm a normal.'" And I had talked about some of the things that Richard Hickok had told my father concerning out there in Garden City after the murders of the Clutter family, and how terrified the people in that community were because of the murders. And I'll just go ahead and continue the quotes to compare the letters from Hickok to my father, written in 1961, to the finished material that Truman Capote named In Cold Blood, that was published in 1965. In Cold Blood, reference page 133, Capote wrote about Hickok running over a dog with his car and saying to Smith, "Boy, we sure splattered him." Is it feasible that the obvious dislike Capote had for Hickok was rooted in the fact that the killer had first given his original story to Mack Nations in 1961? Capote, after his book was written, and after the 2 killers had been executed, during many interviews on television, as well as in newspaper and magazine articles, made it known to the interviewers that he was not fond of Hickok at all, and really detested him as a human being. He may very well have taken things that Dick Hickok told him in talking with Hickok the couple of times that he went up there to Lansing, to the Kansas State Penitentiary. And believe me, that's all that he ever went up there. He was not up at Lansing numerous times. He was only there a very few times in person to interview Perry Smith and Dick Hickok. The accounts in the movies that have been made about the Clutter murders and Perry Smith and Richard Hickok and Truman Capote are inaccurate. In fact, they're deliberately inaccurate accounts. Anybody that wants to check how many times Truman Capote actually visited the 2 murderers on death row at KSP is welcome to do that, and that is recorded in the files of Richard Hickok and Perry Smith. Anyway, too brief a treat. The letters of Truman Capote, edited by Gerald Clark. Quote page 331, 332, written on November 22nd, 1961, written from Verviers, Switzerland, to Alvin and Marie Dewey. However, I wanted at once to thank dear Alvin for the detective information, and also for sending me that extraordinarily vulgar magazine containing the preposterous Hickok, spelled H-I-C-K-C-O-C-K, Nation's Contribution. Dear God, and to think I was worried about Mr. Nations. However, some few details are interesting from my point of view. Also, it is obvious that this article has been cut out of a much longer manuscript. I would certainly be interested to see the original HICKOCK manuscript before Nations tampered with it. Too brief a treat. The letters of Truman Capote, quote 343 from page 343, March 4th, 1962 to Bennett, Cerf, written from Verviers, Switzerland. Remember Matt Nations, the newspaper bastard who has caused me so much trouble? The one who said Random House was publishing his book. End quote. Make a comment about that passage there. When the movie Capote came out, quite a long time ago, it had been a long time since I'd even really thought too much about my dad's involvement with Richard Hickok or High Road to Hell or In Cold Blood. And I decided that I would go and see this movie. There was a lot of acclaim for Philip Seymour Hoffman's representation of Truman Capote and what a magnificent job he did portraying Capote in this movie. And as far as a story made up by Hollywood, that's completely accurate. Historically accurate. The story has very little to do with what actually happened and out there in Garden City, Kansas, except that the 4 members of the family were killed by Perry Smith and Dick Hickok. I couldn't even begin to tell you how much of that story was completely made up, not based on any factual information at all. And I had written to Gerald Clark after I went and saw that film, and I was inquiring as to why he put this quotation in that book that he published and made a great deal of money off of. And he asked me if I was a writer, and I said no. I was not a writer. I was Mac Nation's son, and I just wanted to ask him what kind of trouble my father had caused Truman Capote. And he wrote me back and gave me a political answer that said something to the effect that he couldn't remember. It was 20 years ago when that book was written, and the biography of Capote, which also contains some very demeaning statements about my father in that book. And he said he couldn't remember which man might have been right, and asked me if my father had ever talked to me about this subject. And I wrote him back and I said, well, no. I said I was 13 years old when my father died in December of 1968 in a car wreck out in Colorado. And no, he didn't talk to some young boy about this story. Even though I remembered the book and actually remembered being in the car one Sunday morning when my mother and myself went with my father to Lansing, Kansas, from Topeka, Kansas, where his sister and her family lived. And we rode up there on a Sunday morning with my dad. I was 5 years old at the time, or 6, I guess. And I stayed in the car with my mother on the outside of the penitentiary there. And my dad parked the car, and You know, I'm looking at this great big place with all these high walls made out of stone and barbed wire, and I didn't know anything about what this place was. I'd never seen anything like that. And my dad said that he would be back in a little while. And when he got out of the car, I asked my mother, I said, "Where is Daddy going?" And she said, "Well, he has to go in there and talk to somebody for a little while." And I remember asking my mother, "What is this place? What's in there?" And my mother said, "That is where bad people live." So, yes, I remember, even at a very small age, parts of this very, in many ways bizarre, relationship between my father, who was working independently from the newspaper that he was employed with, the Wichita Eagle and Beacon. He was doing this on the side, on top of being a senior editor for that newspaper, writing this story in collaboration with Richard Hickok. So go back to this. In Cold Blood, reference page 138, meeting Otto the German and the cowboy in Acapulco. So this is where Truman Capote introduces these two individuals into the story in Cold Blood. Richard Hickok, in letter H, written on June 10, 1961, to MACK Nations, tells the story of how he met, along with Perry Smith, this German down there in Acapulco after they'd fled the United States after the murders, and this Mexican young man who called himself the Cowboy. And the reason I bring that up is this wasn't original material that Mr. Capote got in 1962, 63, whenever it was that he got it. It had already been written about by my father in the calendar year 1961, after Dick Hickok told my father all about this. In Cold Blood, reference page 139, Inez, the 18-year-old prostitute Dick had promised to marry in Mexico City. Ashley, in letter G, written by Hickok to Nations on June 12, 1961, he wrote a very long account about meeting this girl, who obviously was a prostitute, and her name, according to Dick Hickok, was Ada, A-D-A. Her real name, full name, was Adriana Castanda, C-A-S-T-A-N-D-A. Another correction from the actual letter from Hickok to Nations in comparison to In Cold Blood, that is supposed to be 100% accurate and original material. In Cold Blood, reference page 140, Smith catches the sailfish the day that he, the German, the cowboy El Charro, and Hickok went fishing together down there in Acapulco. Reference Hickok's June 10, 1961 letter H, written account to Nations. Hickok stated how he and Smith first met El Charro, the cowboy, on the beach in Acapulco, but, quote, the German that rented the boat who caught a 9-foot sailfish, when we got back to the dock, the German, being real drunk, said, I'll see you guys later, and jumped overboard. He almost drowned his fool self. The trip was quite a kick. End quote from Dick Hickok. On that note, it's rather interesting that Perry Smith, who had this dream of going down to Mexico and all the way down there by Costa Rica and getting a boat along with Dick Hickok and finding the lost treasure of Coronado, this gold treasure that he had read about in some magazine or book or fairy tale. He said he knew exactly where it was at and where they could go, and they could go get this, and they'd live happily ever after, etc., etc. And the fact of the matter is, the insanity of all of that was compiled by Perry Smith. Didn't even know how to swim. Reference: Hickok's May 14, 1961 letter written to MACK nations. We caught a local bus and rode it to the east city limits of Vegas. We didn't want to run the risk of trouble with the law trying to catch a ride in town. We stood along the side of the highway with our thumbs hanging out. I don't know how long we were there, but I don't think it was very long. A Buick pulled off the road about 100 feet past us with the scream of sliding tires. The driver waved to us to come on. When I opened the door, I noticed he was a fellow who appeared to be in his middle 30s. He was dressed fairly well, but it was his car that took my eye. It was a maroon and black 1955 Buick Century, and it was in good condition. I figured we could take care of any additional business we may have and do it in style in this buggy. Also, I didn't like his looks, the driver of the car, that is. Something began telling me, this is your chance to be boss. I knew that one other time I had a chance to be boss and got cheated out of it. I wasn't going to be cheated again. I got to thinking how my partner, how he felt. I was afraid he would lie about it, and I wanted to find out myself. Besides, if he told me the truth, it might take all the fun out of it. I have waited for 28 years to find it out. I can wait a little longer. Wait, that is all it seems like I've ever done. When I was little, I wanted to do things, but I had to wait till I got older. And I've been waiting for something ever since. I have often wondered what it really is I'm waiting on. Maybe it's what I had in mind from the owner of the Buick. Maybe I'm waiting for death. We passed through Boulder City and crossed Boulder Dam. We were now in Arizona. I kept trying to catch my partner's eye, and one time I saw him gently shake his head, and his lips moved in silent speech of, "Not yet." We were about 5 or 6 miles from Boulder Dam when the whole deal fell through. My dreams were shattered. The owner of the Buick picked up another hitchhiker. At first, I was furious. I thought to myself, you lousy, rotten, and he doesn't finish the word here as far as what he wants to call this guy. I almost pulled out the gun and shot him while he was driving. I wanted to, but I would have had to have reached over the top of my partner and knew he wouldn't like that. After a while, I cooled down and considered it a bust. That hitchhiker saved the Buick owner's life. Now that I'm writing this, I wonder why I didn't kill them. That's an interesting last sentence there, because it doesn't say kill the driver or kill you know, the guy that got in the car may have very well been all of them, Smith and the passenger and the driver of that car. In cold blood, quote page 178. This was not the type of setup he and Perry wanted. They were waiting for some solitary traveler in a decent car and with money in his billfold, a stranger to rob, strangle, discard on the desert. In cold blood, page 198. Imagine going all out to impress a man you were going to kill, a man who wouldn't be alive 10 minutes from now. Not if the plan he and Dick had devised went smoothly. In cold blood, quote, pages 199 to 200. But just as Perry raised his hand and the rock was on the verge of descent, something extraordinary occurred. What Perry later called a goddamn miracle. The miracle was the sudden appearance of a third hitchhiker, a Negro soldier, for whom the charitable salesman stopped. "Say, that's pretty cute," he said as his savior ran toward the car. "When you gotta go, you gotta go." In cold blood, quote page 166, Capote writes that Smith stated to Hickok, "The only regret I have, I wish the hell my sister would have been in that house." In parentheses, Dick had laughed and confessed to a similar yearning. "I keep thinking what fun if my second wife had been there, her and all of her goddamn family." End quote. Reference. Hickok's statements made the nations in his May 26, 1961 B letter concerning how he wished Finney County Judge Tate and the jurors at his Garden City, Kansas trial would have been inside the Clutter house the night of the murders. In parentheses, every other time I was taken to the courtroom, the handcuffs were taken off. This time they stayed on and I was cuffed to the undersheriff. When the verdict was given and the jury said the punishment was to be death, I wasn't surprised. I leaned over to the undersheriff and I couldn't help laughing when I told him it was what I expected. I thought to myself that these pompous old ginks was the lousiest looking specimen of manhood that I'd ever seen. Old cronies that acted like they were God or somebody. I wished every one of them had been at the Clutter house that night, and that included the judge. I would have found out how much God they had in them. If they were there and had any God in them, I would let it run out on the floor. I then wished I could do it while they were sitting in the courtroom. Now there was something that would have really stirred them up. When they filed out of the courtroom, not one of them would look at me. I looked each one in the face and kept thinking, "Look at me. Look at me. Look at me." But none of them would. In cold blood, reference page 177, Dewey's original theory. A few of his conclusions were unshakable. He believed that the death of Herb Clutter had been the criminal's main objective. This is really important right here. We're going to get to a really pinnacle point of why I wrote this and why I'm doing these videos during this section of these quotations. The motive being a psychopathic hatred or possibly a combination of hatred and thievery, and he believed that the commission of the murders had been a leisurely labor, with perhaps 2 or more hours elapsing between the entrance of the killers and their exit. Hickok told Nations in his second letter, written on May 14, 1961, that he was going to kill someone, or maybe more than one person the night of the Clutter murders, that he was being paid to kill them, and that he had already spent some of the money, and that he couldn't back out of the deal. 3 a.m. meeting with Roberts. Family all murdered by 2 a.m. Smith and Hickok drove towards Scott City, Kansas, pulled over, and used the same knife that had killed Herb Clutter to dig a hole in the dirt on a country road to bury the used shotgun shells, extra rope used to tie the family with, and duct tape used to tape the family's mouths shut. In Cold Blood, quote from page 262, Capote writes, "Maybe they did it, these fellows, but there's more to it than that. Wait, someday they will get to the bottom, and when they do, they'll find the one behind it, the one wanted Clutter out of the way, the brains." I can't stress the gravity of those quotations written by Truman Capote in relation to the story that Richard Hickok told MACK Nations. It is my opinion that Truman Capote is interjecting all of this into In Cold Blood to say a little bit about something, but not really say what he really means. And my father's story said exactly what Richard Hickok meant, and this only is intimating the same type of information, that there's more to this story than this robbery plan out there to Garden City, hoping that they would find a safe, not really knowing that the safe was there, etc., etc. And this is kind of what people for the past, since 1965, when In Cold Blood was made, have been led to believe. This is what they think this case was really about. But it says here in Capote's book that Alvin Dewey, the lead investigator for the KBI, never thought that at all. He always thought that this thing was about someone purposely planning on murdering Herb Clutter. That's a very different angle. That's a very different motivation for these murders than robbery. Who was the twice mentioned individual named Roberts that Hickok told Nations about in his first handwritten 8-page letter? Reference: second letter from Hickok to Nations, written on May 14, 1961. Here is my main point and the major difference between Capote's version and the story given to MACK Nations by Richard Hickok. Smith and Hickok got set up by Floyd Wells, Hickok's old cellmate, that brought up the story of the Clutters, and that Mr. Clutter had a safe that he had seen installed in his office while he worked there on the farm, and that he knew for certain there was at least $10,000 cash inside the safe at all times, maybe more than that. Why did 3 different KBI agents ask Mr. Hickok if he had noticed Dick having any extra money as written on the single draft page from High Road to Hell? I happen to have that single draft page. It was inside the Mail magazine article. It's the only draft page from that original manuscript, and it was inside the Mail magazine issue from December 1961, and it was in the closet that I found, that I discovered at my mother's apartment in Pratt, Kansas, probably 30 years ago, maybe more than that, and it was in there along with the 4 original handwritten letters from Richard Hickok to Mack nations that I still have in my own possession. Why did Alvin Dewey always believe that the Clutters were executed and not just randomly killed by Smith and Hickok as a result of Smith's psychological meltdown, as Capote writes in his book? Does Capote's in cold blood written account actually add up? Consider the following, and I'll stop after I read this next part, because I don't want this video to go past about 30-35 minutes. That's about the time frame that I've made these in, because I would like for people to watch the videos and not overload them. I'll make another one later on, maybe in the next week or so, to continue the story. Hickok's 1959 pre-parole plan submitted to Kansas State Penitentiary officials for review indicated that the inmate, Richard Hickok, planned to return home where he could assist in supporting his parents and children by working full-time on the family's farm and paying off his debts to his creditors. Perry Smith also told prison officials a very similar plan of action in 1959. He had intended to return out west in Nevada, where his father lived and worked. Tex Smith had written 3 times to Kansas pardon and parole attorney Dale Spiegel in 1957, offering to sponsor his son with a job and a place to live upon his release from the penitentiary. Smith claimed that once he was reunited with his father, he would be able to offer care and support for him, as well as becoming a productive citizen in the community. Perry Smith would be granted his official conditional release from KSP on July 2, 1959, and soon afterwards found himself reunited with his father again. Smith's lofty plans of finding viable employment and being able to transition to an amicable life in the company of his father never did materialize. Instead, resentment and disappointment returned to Perry Smith's world shortly after his release from prison. Hickok's continual promise of the perfect score came only months later, and Perry Smith soon found himself riding a bus back to Kansas with his coveted maps of Coronado's sunken treasure in Mexico and visions of wealth and fame that lived only inside his own mind. I'm going to stop here for the 5th video, and I hope that the people that watch this will really take this to heart, because this is the crux of the difference between my father's story gotten from Richard Hickok and the totality of the story that is presented in Cold Blood. I'll continue this later, probably sometime this week or within the next 10 days.